All right, this is video 3 for periodization. What you see here is a very general example of periodized training where goals are prioritized by sports season. This is just to give you an idea of what periodization kind of looks like in very simple terms, and then we'll get into all the detail of it. So first we see sports season, sport practice, and resistance training. So looking at where's the priority given. Then we see resistance training goal. So first we have our off season. With our off season, resistance training is usually very high. We start with hypertrophy and muscular endurance to build the base and increase lean muscle mass. And then we'll transition to strength and power kind of later in the off season. The preseason is, you see medium sport practice and medium resistance training, but the focus is more on sport-specific movements with a certain focus, depending on the sport, whether y'all said that your main goal was strength or power or endurance. So then that would be kind of the next focus. And then in season, we would have high sport practice and low resistance training. Like we said, it's just a maintenance of that preseason training goal, whatever goal we were focusing on the most. And then our postseason is highly variable depending on the athlete. It's not specific at all. It may be other recreational activities, some light resistance training, a little bit of sport skills here and there, but nothing too intense. All right, but that gets us to our actual linear model that we want to discuss. So what this linear model suggests is a systematic shift in training from general non-specific, so high volume, low intensity, to specific training of low volume, high intensity. And so we look here, we see changes in both volume and intensity are relatively linear, so that's where this name comes in. But we have 4 different seasons here, and we're going to break down these seasons and go into exactly what takes place in each one. So our preparation phase or preparatory phase, we have a high volume non-specific work. And we have pretty low to moderate intensity and very little technique training at all. And then we transition. So our first transition is, so this is our off season, is our prep phase. Our first transition is our preseason. So then you see the volume start to decrease, and then the intensity and sport-specific training starts to increase. And then we move into our competition phase. This is our end season. We see then a pretty steep drop in volume. So low volume work, but intensity and sport skills increases all the way up until we hit this is our peak in performance. So this is when our main competitions occur right here. We have a peak in technique, we have a peak in intensity of training, and you also see volumes very low. Second transition is the postseason. So once we get done with our training, all these variables start to slowly decrease. Let me go back. This model basically suggests progression from a large volume of work at a relatively low intensity to build a base of fitness, and then transition to lower volume, high intensity work. So we're basically building on simple skills to produce a sound foundation for more complex items. So the periods serve as pathways for developing basic skills into complex sport-specific skills. So we see the lines are represented as straight, but you can also see these are little fluctuations. So fluctuations in training occur daily, microcycle, mesocycle level due to load changes and load changes, volume changes. Okay, next here we kind of go more specific. We want to talk about each mesocycle. It has one specific goal. Each training goal we can see is addressed. It's going to be a stepwise program. So traditional model, who is this good for? Recreational athletes and beginners. So most of y'all are recreational athletes unless you do play a sport for Texas Tech. And a lot of you are also beginners. So the linear model is really good for starting a new training program. So here we have our phases. Let me tell you what those periods are. So this is our preparatory phase, both of these right here. So this is our off season. We're going to start with hypertrophy of low to moderate intensity, but a high volume of work. We want to build up lean muscle mass. And then we have our basic strength training. So this is high intensity, but a moderate to high volume. And then we progress to the first transition. This is our preseason. The focus now is strength and power. It can be low to very high intensity and then moderate to low volume. Then we have our competition. This is our end season. So we'll talk about the difference between a peaking or a maintenance phase. But our intensity can be very high to very low for our peaking. And then for our moderate, it's moderate to a high intensity. Volume is low to very low. And then last we see is our active rest phase. Low intensity, low volume. This is our postseason. This is where everything kind of settles down. So I'm going to go into each of these phases again in more detail. One of the most complex aspects of training, this is the most complex because it incorporates a subtle trade-off between opposing training demands. So every time we move from one phase to another, it's a subtle change in what our actual focus is. But it does use predictable loading schemes. It's easy for athletes and coaches to follow since training load is determined by whatever phase you're in. So it kind of takes the guesswork out of our planning each load and the reps. That's what the good thing about this linear model is. It's very predictable and it's easy to follow. All right, so let's start with our preparatory period. One thing to keep in mind as I go through this is the basis of your assignment 4 model. So there's going to be a separate video, which you may have already watched, that goes over assignment 4. But all these phases, this is how you will create your assignment. Also keep in mind, if you plan to sit for the CSCS exam, you have to know periodization forward and backward. You have to know everything about it, how to use each phase, how to design training programs in each phase. And we'll give examples of that throughout this lecture. So preparatory period or off season occurs when there's no competitions in technical or tactical sport-specific work. All that's limited. We want to develop a base level of conditioning to increase the athlete's ability to tolerate more intense training later on. We have 2 emphases here. The first emphasis is to build an endurance base with high volume, low intensity aerobic training, and then also different types of conditioning. The second part is, the second emphasis is to I also forgot. So within that first emphasis is hypertrophy training. So LBM is lean body mass. The preparatory period, if you're using the linear model, is the only time you can train for hypertrophy. So, and I'll talk more about specifics on if you think that's necessary for your specific athlete or not, but I'm strictly just going to go over the model in this video. So with this linear model, hypertrophy only occurs in the off season. It does not occur anywhere else. So we want to increase lean body mass with a hypertrophy focused training of our sport specific muscles. This is our bulking phase because some weight loss will occur in the preseason and the end season. So we want to make sure that we're not losing muscle mass when we start that really intense training. So we bulk, we build up our muscle, and then we move to a basic strength phase. So our basic strength phase is of high intensity, moderate to high volume. So let's kind of look specifically at each of these phases. We see for our high volume, we see 3 to 6 sets. That's consistent with hypertrophy that we learned in program design, but we see 8 to 20 reps. So this hypertrophy phase is also like endurance training as well. So it takes on a hypertrophy endurance focus. So you do have to keep the training goal hypertrophy separate from the hypertrophy phase. The hypertrophy phase goes all the way from 8 to 20 reps and then 50 to 75% of the 1RM. You see that the 8 reps does not equal 80%. That means that we're not doing 8 RMs in this phase. We're doing 8 reps at a little bit lighter intensity. So I've given you kind of a sample workout here. We have dumbbell flies, bent over rows, deadlifts, and RDL. We can see that, again, the 8 reps using a 75% load, 10 is using 67, 12 is using 65. So the intensity is a little bit lower, but the volume is very high. with our basic strength phase. We have high intensity training. If we look at so 80 to 95, if we look at this to see if this matches, the 2 reps, 2 reps or 2 RM would be about 95%. But our 6 reps, if we're doing a 6 RM, that would be 85%. But again, we reduce that intensity just a little bit. So we're doing 6 reps at 80% instead of 85. We look over here, we have lat pull down, bench press, back squat, good mornings. So again, some of these intensities, or actually all of these intensities are slightly lower, except for this one. For back squat, we have a 6 RM, 6 reps at 65. But the others, the intensity is a little bit lighter. Just remember, this is our preparatory phase. So it's mainly just endurance training or a conditioning and lots of resistance training with a higher volume, moderate intensity. One thing to keep in mind is that prep period that we just looked at right here is split into 2 phases. The first phase is the GPP. This is where the hypertrophy endurance resistance training occurs. So again, it's a base level of fitness. We're just trying to prepare the athlete, potentiate them for higher intensity training later on. We elevate their overall working capacity and focus on general motor skills. So the GPP is used to increase lean muscle mass, develop endurance, so muscle and metabolic endurance to establish a foundation, increase tolerance for higher intensity conditioning. It may not be very sport specific in this phase, but that's okay. We just want to make sure that we are building up our ability to handle more intense work. So for our strength power athlete, an example would be we would focus on hypertrophy and then transition to strength and power. Where our endurance athlete, we may focus on strength and endurance with just a little bit of hypertrophy. So it just kind of depends on the athlete that we have. So for another GPP example, let's say we have a 100-meter sprinter. For that sprinter, let's say they would perform longer distance runs, whereas like 400s to build a foundation at a slower pace. And then they would add low intensity plyometrics, and then with basic resistance training like back squat, leg press, leg curl. So that would kind of be an example of what, let's say, a 100-meter sprinter would do in the GPP. SPP is the second part of the preparatory period. Now we're more specific. So transition from an emphasis that's really broad to a more narrow technique focus. So now we've started more sport-specific training. This is where the basic strength resistance training comes in. So an example, SPP example for our sprinter, our 100-meter sprinter would progress to interval runs of moderate distance, more complex, specialized plyometrics, more sport-specific, or more specific to running, resistance training work involving heavy loads, low volume, like let's say single leg squat or power clean or any type of just basic strength work. All right, now we've made our first transition. So our first transition, this is our preseason. We can see our focus on strength and power. We want to maximize this process, facilitate recovery, vary training intensity and volume at the microcycle level. So our goal is to slowly increase intensity. We're elevating strength and translating all that strength into power. So this is our link between the off season and the end season. So the link between preparatory and the competition phase. What does our training look like? This is the first transition. The phase that occurs here is the strength power phase. So the strength power phase, we see low to very high intensity, depending on if we're doing a core or a power exercise, and then a pretty low volume. So let's kind of look at this. We see down here we have non-power, so just our basic core exercises. We see 2 to 5 reps for each strength or each core and power. But these do match. So if I'm doing 5 reps, I'm doing a 5 RM because it's going to be closer to 87%. Same thing with the 2 RM, closer to the 95%. We already know about power, how we have to reduce the intensity so we can accelerate the bar, so we can move quicker. So if we're using a barbell or just like a kettlebell, dumbbell, that load should be closer to the 30 side. If we're using a barbell, it's going to be closer to the 65 to 85 side, and that would be both using the 2 to 5 reps. So here's an example down here. We have hang cleans, push press, back squat. We're doing single arm rows and lunges and calf raises. And so I have reps, I have intensity. You can see for the power exercises, it's a lot lower, but for the core, like back squat, we've got a 4RM at 90%. We've got lunges, pretty high intensity lunges, and then our calf raises. So just remember, you can add like a random auxiliary lift in a strength power phase, but the focus should be mainly on building strength and power. So let's go back to our sprinter example. So a strength power example for our 100-meter sprinter, let's say they do interval and speed work at intensities near competitive pace. They add speed drills, sled toes, uphill sprints. The resistance training involves power at low to very high loads with a decreased volume. So 5 reps for cleans, 80 to 85%. Bench press throws or push press at about 50 to 70%. So in order to develop both strength and power in this phase, we really need to use this mixed training approach. Heavy and lower load training to optimize both of these attributes. So this is our preseason, and we're about to transition to our competition. In between the preseason and the competition, there may be like a week or so break, depending on the sport, or a few days off to let fatigue subside and make that transition. But now we're in the end season. So what type of training occurs here? Our central aim is to prepare the athlete for competition by further increasing strength and power via additional increase in intensity and decrease in volume. So we have a peak in sport skills and intensity of training. We have a decreased volume of overall work being done, though, with our resistance training. Emphasis is still explosiveness, power, and near maximal strength. So with this phase, it's a delicate balancing act. We want to make sure that the adequate volume and intensity needed to maintain competition preparedness, but reduce volume and intensity needed to optimize recovery and increase performance. So we need to remember the fitness fatigue paradigm here. So it's a very nice balancing act between intensity and volume. So we have 2 phases. We have a peaking and a maintenance phase. So what I kind of want you to think about with these two is you're not just either peaking or maintenance. You can be in a maintenance phase and then hit a peak, or you can hit your peak first and then go back into a maintenance phase. So these phases are dependent on the sport, the athlete, the coach, the trainer, however they want their athlete to hit a peak or how long they want them to be in a maintenance phase. So I'll kind of start explaining both. So with our peak, we said it's about 1 to 2 weeks, so possibly 3, but normally we want to keep it to the 1 to 2 week range. Extending past may reduce performance capacity, and reduce fitness may create OTS. Load reductions to decrease fatigue, and we want to have a taper before competition, which we'll look at on the next slide. Resistance training % 1RM range depends on where the athlete is in the peak. We see 50 to 93% or greater with only 1 to 3 reps. So 1 to 3 reps, very low volume, and the set number is also very low. So over here is an example. We have 2 reps, 87% on snatch. We have front squat, bench press, and then shoulder press. We can see that intensity and volume there. Our maintenance phase, we can usually do this for a prolonged competitive season that requires intensity and volume manipulation on a microcycle level. This is to maintain strength and power while managing fatigue associated with the frequency of our competitive schedule. So monitor fatigue and recovery during our end season. So we see moderate to high intensity, the 85 to 93, low to moderate volume, 2 to 5 sets, 3 to 6 reps. So here's kind of an example, but it really just shows a 90% at either doing 3 reps or 4 reps. So like 4 RMs with this. So an example of our sprinter in competition, our 100-meter sprinter, let's say the emphasis is on speed, reaction time, sprint-specific plyometrics, technical training, decreasing ground contact time, increasing stride rate, arm swing. It's all really sport-specific. So the exercises done here are going to be very specific to the athlete. We're still doing some conditioning work, but it's all sport specific. It's a lot of just practicing for that sport. So just kind of remember what I said with this. This is the linear model, so you may not have done this in your sport. You may not have used this type of design, and that's okay. This is just one model that's very popular, especially with our beginner athletes. So with the peaking and maintenance, just remember that those can occur anytime during the competitive season. You can be in a maintenance phase, hit a peak, or hit your peak first and then go back down into a maintenance phase. So it's kind of highly variable. But let's look here at some rules to follow to ensure we hit our peak. So we already know the volume is reduced. We have a very low volume and a high intensity. This is the mesocycle leading up to competition. Mesocycle, remember, is that 4-week block or so. We also have sport-specific training as we get closer. So during competition, our sport-specific training is very high. We're trying to make sure our sport skills are perfect for execution. And then a taper. We want to taper before. What's the taper? The taper is the delayed transformation. The delayed transmutation is this number 2 with the sport specificity. But we have to take a break. So right before, so for an example, if I'm training for a marathon, I'm not going to, run 20 miles, a few days before my race. I'm going to taper my intensity. I'm not going to train very much on that week or 2 weeks leading up. That's where that delayed transformation occurs, allowing the body to accumulate all those adaptations to where we hit this overcompensation. And so that's what this shows here. So the steps represent 1 to 2 week microcycles. So we've gone, 2 weeks and then 2 more weeks, and we're really tired. So we have a high level of fatigue, but we start to rest. So we've reached kind of our highest kind of point in our training. And then this is our taper. So 4 and 5 step downs are the taper. And if you notice, our performance starts to increase. And then it's actually going to increase above our baseline, which is the dotted line here. And here's our main competition. So that's what this taper shows. We increase intensity all the way up until we get close to our competition. And then let's say a few weeks to a month out, we slowly taper down. We're still training, but at lower intensities. That allows the body to recover, and we overcompensate or supercompensate right when we hit competition. So those are kind of the strategies used to hit a peak. One thing to keep in mind is that very hard training over several months is of little to no value if an athlete is unable to peak and display improved performance at the correct or the planned time. So it doesn't even matter if an athlete hits a peak and that peak is nowhere near competition. We have to make sure the peak occurs close to competition. But yeah, so that's our peaking strategy. Last is the active rest phase. So this is our last phase here. This is our second transition, also called the postseason. Again, this is a highly variable season. It's dependent on the sports, the athletes, the coach, the trainers. You kind of do whatever you want in this phase. It's our restoration phase. The main goal is to prepare the body for subsequent training periods, because right after the postseason, you would start your off season again. So postseason can last anywhere from 1 to 2 weeks to 1 to 2 months. But just remember, the longer the postseason, the greater amount of training is going to have to be done in the off season to get us back into shape. So we can do unloading weeks where we slowly take the weight off the bar, or completely deload where we just stop lifting weights altogether. So usually lasts 2 to 4 weeks kind of on average. But like I said, if it's extended, we'll need a longer GPP phase to regain our performance capacity. We want to avoid aggressive training. We want to rehab injuries, rest physically, avoid OTS, recover mentally, avoid burnout. So I have an example. If an athlete wanted to lift weights, we have 10 to 15 reps here at lower intensity, 65, but that even may be considered high. We could do body weight training. We can do just dumbbell work. We could play, it says here, recreational activities, non-specific training. Just remember, like, this is your time to recover. So some people tell me, like, my sport doesn't take a break. I'm pretty sure they do. I'm pretty sure they're going to take a day off. And so they're going to take a few days off, maybe a week off, and then they'll start training again. So when you design your assignment 4, just kind of keep that in mind. You're just explaining, what does their active rest day look like? They're still moving, they're still recovering, they're still training somehow, but it's at a very low volume and a very low intensity. This chart here is a great chart for studying, for memorization. It's everything I just said, but put into a chart. And the numbers match identically. Everything is the exact same from the slides I just went over. So it gives you the sub-period, it gives you the season, it tells you the phase, and then it gives you intensity, gives you a description of the intensity, and then also gives you percent of the 1RM. It tells you a description of the volume, the sets, and the reps. So this chart will become your best friend if you're studying for the CSCS. It will also be your best friend for the next exam and the final exam. And it'll be your best friend for assignment 4. So this chart is so important. So yeah, this is a really good studying tool. So I'll stop this video because it's kind of long.